If you listen to the left, the Detroit suburb Dearborn is a beacon of peace, tranquility, and equality. A paradise where multiculturalism not only can work, but absolutely does work. It works so well that indeed perhaps the rest of the United States should look up to Dearborn rather than down upon, and should try to emulate the wonders created in this town of 100,000 people just 6 miles outside of the city of Detroit. Huffington Post in particular has been busy over the last decade to sing the praises of this place, going so far as to call Dearborn's gigantic Shiite mosque as the most spiritual place in Michigan. That is in addition to reprinting every propaganda piece about the suburb claiming it's news. If you listen to the right, Dearborn is an Islamist hellhole akin to Stockholm's Rinkeby, Malmö's Rosengård, or Paris's Seine-Saint-Denis. Almost 100 years ago, Dearborn was the home of the largest automobile plant in the world. That's when immigration into the area started growing, including from the Middle East. Yet this was never an issue, neither with the left nor with the right, until the beginning of this decade. Why is that? And what exactly is going on in Dearborn? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative and welcome to Dearborn, Michigan, the home of what was once the largest automobile plant in the world and today the home of the largest mosque in North America. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله. What you're hearing is the Adhan, or the Islamic call to prayer, played 5 times a day both from this gigantic mosque and also from the Islamic Cultural Center located in a more central area. We went to Dearborn in the hope of getting some footage that we'd then use to illustrate how an area with a significant Islamic presence in the United States is different than one in Europe, since I already expected it wouldn't exactly be like in Rinkeby, as the usual right-wing bias would go. However, what we found in Dearborn was slightly more different than both of the narratives circulating about the place, and it is one of the main reasons why this video appears now, more than a year since our visit to Dearborn occurred in May 2018. We left Dearborn with a lot more questions than answers, so as a result, some of us kept on digging some more with a view that I'd rather make a video later or even never than make a superficial one that may have been timelier then. I'm still not convinced we got the full picture, but at least now I know enough to provide enough nuance that would then piss off enough people. So, to understand this city, one has to take at least a quick glance at its history. As with most cities in the United States, the history is pretty short and it starts with the 19th century when a village emerges here in 1833, Dearbornville, named in the honor of Henry Dearborn, who had just died a few years prior. Henry Dearborn was and is a somewhat important figure in American history, as Mr. Dearborn was a general in the American Revolution and later served as Secretary of War under President Thomas Jefferson. However, the place becomes a proper town 60 years later in 1893 when the town of Dearborn is incorporated and then becomes a city only in 1927. This period is associated with the rapid industrial growth of the Detroit area and with the development of Dearborn thanks to Henry Ford, who was from this area and bought large swaths of the city for his estate. Many details about that period between 1918 and until the death of Henry Ford are easily available on the internet, so I won't go through those, but I will show you how the Ford complex looks like now. Just driving around it took forever. It's really quite spectacular. The Ford complex is essentially a whole new city within the city. The initial version had a surface of 4 square kilometers, and even during the Great Depression, it still employed some 100,000 people. It was so big that it had its own police department. Anyway, the point is that Ford has had a profound influence on the city in the last 100 years and continues to have one to this day, the automotive company whose world headquarters is located here still being by far the largest employer in the city. But it's not the history of the city's automotive industry that brought me to Dearborn, but rather its multiple civilizational shifts that occurred in such short periods of time. Initially, after the US gained independence, the city was populated mostly by individuals of Irish, German, and Polish descent. Later on, Italians and notably Maltese individuals also poured into the city, largely drawn by the rapid growth of the automotive industry. But in the same period, immigrants from the Middle East started coming too, though mostly Middle Eastern Christians, particularly Lebanese, Assyrians, and general Arab Christians from modern-day Yemen and Iraq. To this day, Dearborn retains the largest Lebanese community in the United States of America. So when the left says that Dearborn has a long tradition of welcoming people from the Middle East, they're not lying. They're just avoiding the issue, or pretending that the issue is an ethno-racial one, when it isn't. The issue being, of course, a certain religion of special needs. While it is true that Middle Easterners have been a part of Dearborn for at least 80 years now, there was never a problem with them until about 20 years ago when two things happened. 1. The type of Middle Eastern immigrant arriving to Dearborn changed dramatically. It was no longer Arab Christians fleeing oppression and persecution, but their oppressors coming over. And 2. The politics of the city changed pretty rapidly. Now, if you listen to Politico, this is Bush's fault by default. However, if you look at migration trends, the worst that can be said about George W. Bush on this topic is that he cut to the chase much faster. Even before 2001, more and more votes for really unsavory, far left politics started to come from this area, and also more and more radical events started to take place here. And that has steadily been growing regardless of who was in power federally. One of the reasons almost nobody noticed this between 1998 and really 2014-ish is because most of the people of Middle Eastern descent in Dearborn were, and still are, bona fide Americans first. Another reason is still related to numbers. While the impact of the Middle Eastern population is, at least in my opinion, quite disproportionate, the absolute numbers are still pretty low, which is one of the reasons even here Donald Trump got 30% of the vote, even though Politico had predicted a few months earlier that it is impossible for the now President of the United States to get anything beyond single digits in so-called the most diverse place in America. This comes because reality is a bit more complicated than what the cathedral media and the Democrats, but I repeat myself, would have you believe. In reality, this area has been thoroughly Republican between 1972 and 1988, and since 2010 has once again seen steadily increase in Republican support, and it is not ethnic-based, but philosophy-based. Why does this happen? Well, the short version is this. Normal people are starting to have enough of this. What this? Well, as mentioned earlier, over the last 20 years, there has been a steady increase of a form of extremism in local government which tended to lean heavily in favor of a certain religion of special needs and heavily against basic constitutional freedoms. For instance, in 2010, 4 Christian missionaries, at least one of them of Middle Eastern descent, were arrested because they spoke in public about the Bible and about the Quran. This is not my own interpretation, but the interpretation of multiple courts, as well as the publicly available evidence here on YouTube, which shows the local PD essentially enforcing Sharia law. In this video, I'll include only the relevant part, but links are in the low bar with the whole unedited footage. 3 years of litigation later, the city finally apologized, paid reparations, and the individuals were acquitted in court. The city was found to have violated the constitutional rights related to freedom of speech of the Christians in question, and the lawsuit was settled. But that didn't stop the local government from continuing its practices of censorship. One such example is the continuous involvement by the City Hall, and particularly by the far-left Democrat Mayor Jack O'Reilly Jr., into the affairs of what gets published about the city. Most recently, the mayor tried to suppress a biography of Henry Ford, which discussed, among many other things, the fact that Ford was an anti-Semite. Apparently, that wasn't something the mayor liked to see broadcasted. It could be because virulent anti-Semitism, as well as virulent anti-Christianity and virulent anti-white rhetoric, is part and parcel of many public events in Dearborn. Needless to say, the freedom of speech of militant Islamists is sacrosanct and thoroughly defended by the city of Dearborn, but in the good old tradition of the far left, the freedom of speech of those who happen to disagree, well, not so much. But it goes beyond that. I suspect one of the reasons this particular suburb has gotten so much attention in non-leftist circles, besides the high presence of a certain religion, is the fact that the local government and the wider left invest quite a lot in propaganda about this area, trying really hard to tell everyone that nothing fishy is going on in Dearborn. Now, driving and walking around the city does indeed give this impression that there's nothing particularly remarkable in Dearborn, but when you try really hard to tell everyone that, well, questions do emerge. It's how human nature works. If I were to start making 2 videos a month telling you that absolutely nothing is wrong with my hometown, for instance, then surely enough people will start looking into my hometown. The same is true for Dearborn. And it doesn't get better when one can easily find that the mayor outright admits to spending a lot of time doing essentially agitation and propaganda about his city. One such example is this 2015 Daily Beast article, which, besides the admission that the mayor is into agitprop, we also find a counterfactual account of the incident with the Christians missionaries mentioned earlier. The Daily Beast says, quote, "In 2011, Quran-burning Florida preacher Terry Jones hopped on the Dearborn bandwagon, planning to demonstrate against, the non-existent spread of Sharia law. Stopped by a court, Jones returned in 2012 and again in 2014. He's been to the city and been tried in its U.S. and state law-governed court for breach of the peace in 2011, when he and a companion were released after being ordered by the judge to cough up $2. And still, Jones seems to believe Sharia law is happening," unquote. This is standard scientific lying. 70% truth, 20% fiction, 10% noise, and 100% omission of relevant facts. Such as the relevant fact that Terry Jones was found not guilty of breaching the peace, or the relevant fact that the city was found guilty of violating the Constitution, or the relevant fact that the city admitted in public to having done so and paid reparations. This kind of apparently sloppy reporting is everywhere when it comes to Dearborn, but only when it comes to Dearborn. Reporting on neighboring Detroit contains the normal amount of sloppy reporting, meaning that one can reasonably believe the reporters made an honest mistake and that generally they don't. But when it comes to Dearborn, it is more than curious how often, almost 100% of the time, the press makes these kinds of mistakes. When a mistake is consistent enough, there comes a point when maybe it's not a mistake, but rather intentional. So we dug deeper and found that it is not uncommon, and it has in fact gotten worse over the last 3 years, for the minority Muslim community to attempt to police everyone's public speech in accordance with the House of Peace. For instance, just a few months ago, in May, the mayor invoked the Ramadan as a reason to fire a city employee who had the audacity to mock the burkini in a Facebook post. The city employee had mistakenly believed he's in America. Well, not so fast. How did that happen? Well, the city's propaganda and PR appears to be run mostly by a rather notorious group, the Council on American Islamic Relations, an organization with quite a reputation for being essentially a front group of Hamas and the main defender of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States. As a side note, the Muslim Brotherhood, thoroughly defended by Cairo, are considered a terrorist group by most Muslim-majority countries. The Muslim Brotherhood is too harsh for the governments of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Bahrain, or the United Arab Emirates. Speaking of the United Arab Emirates, the UAE considers the Council on American Islamic Relations to also be a terrorist organization. Maybe they're not that far off. In any event, the point is that this particular city, while not a no-go zone in a European sense, is at the center of many weird cases. Here's another one thoroughly documented by the publication The Arab American News, which has its headquarters in Dearborn. 2 years ago, a Christian man opened up a coffee shop. That's it. That's the controversy. For about a year, the local Arab press circulated insinuations, innuendo, and basic concern trolling because a Christian man dared to open a coffee shop that has a vaguely religious name because it's called Common Grace. They were labeled undercover missionaries, and community leaders made bombastic statements such as Zainab Charmi, a Dearborn educator, who said, quote, "Apparently, we were ignorantly funding our own attempted conversion to Christianity," unquote. If such a statement had been made by a white Christian guy about a kebab shop simply because the place serves kebab and the owner is a Muslim, he would have been deemed a conspiracist loon. And oftentimes rightfully so. But sweeping generalizations about the majority of America are absolutely halal and fair game in the Dearborn public discourse.
And as the brothers and sisters have chanted before, it is true, there is only one solution, Intifada revolution. We're here this year, and we'll be here next year, inshallah, and every year after that, despite the fact that each successive year sees another resistance group on the terror list, another group that we're supposedly not allowed to talk about. We're going to be here to say that Hamas has the right to resist, and the Revolutionary Guards of Iran have the right to resist, and whoever's sensitive about it or not, Hezbollah has the right to resist. Hayhat minna dhillah! Hayhat minna dhillah!
None of these things are visible if you just walk around the town, but there are a few things that are visible even if one doesn't do much digging. For instance, even though Chicago has a numerous Spanish and Polish-speaking community, there are no bilingual or trilingual signs in the city. In Dearborn, on the other hand, almost everything is in Arabic, oftentimes Arabic first. That's neither a good thing nor a bad thing, but it does stand out as opposed to many other areas and cities in the USA. Another thing that stands out is the almost total public segregation. The city is literally divided between the Muslim quarter and the rest of the city. Between them, there's this road on which there's nothing, just empty land for a few hundred meters between the two sections of the city. While we were trying to work out how the city works, we stopped the car to ask a local how to get to the downtown area. Instead of directions, the first question was, which one, the new or the old? Which we later figured it out was the polite way of saying the Muslim downtown versus the American downtown. This aspect is one of the few where Dearborn does resemble areas of Europe. Most recently, during my German tour, I lived for a few days in a Berlin neighborhood that used to be known for its abundance of gay bars and generally homosexuals living there, while now it is thoroughly segregated between the followers of a particular religion and the rest. Schöneberg is the neighborhood, but I'll talk more about that when I finally get to the German tour stories. Anyway, back to Dearborn, one positive aspect that I can say about it is that generally one is not made to feel unwelcome to the degree this occurs in similar areas in Europe. The general American attitude of nobody cares what you do as long as you don't harm anyone seems to have thoroughly been transmitted to essentially everyone. And that's a good thing. Ultimately, the story of Dearborn needs to be, at least in part, separated into the general population and the politics. From a civilizational perspective, most of the general population, regardless of ethnicity and religion, appears to be doing fine. And that's both by statistical metrics and also by how things are felt in the field. The colleague which accompanied me and helped a lot with the US tour in general was noting during our trip that the city is more American than either of the dominating narratives about it would have us believe if we had only read about it. The people somewhat made it work, at least in my opinion, as I value freedom of association a lot more than equality of any kind. However, from a politics perspective, there is a serious civilizational concern that, sooner or later, will have to be addressed somehow. And the non-left will have to address it in ways that the American non-left is not accustomed to, namely via infiltration, intelligence gathering, and more astute and, dare I say, top-tier agitprop. Top tier as opposed to the low tier, low quality bait type of agitprop that has been attempted so far. Non-leftists interested in addressing the political concern of Dearborn will have to first understand the issue much better. And I refer specifically to non-leftists because there is no reason to expect sanity or reason from the left. On the left, these things are clear. This is a rainbow diverse place full of oppressed POC and the racist far right doesn't like it. That's the narrative on the left and they won't renounce it anytime soon. It doesn't even matter that Middle Easterners are considered white for US census purposes and that Dearborn by leftists' ethno-racial standards is one of the least diverse places in Michigan. Nobody cares. If the holy narrative says something, then that is what they will say. Non-leftists, on the other hand, have a duty to understand and be better, and that has to start with the fact that the issue is the political lobby, not the regular Joe and Jane. Most of the issues in Dearborn, otherwise correctly identified by non-leftists, do not come from the will, funding, or participation of the average Joe in the city, regardless of religion, but from the will and funding of a tiny group, most of it not even American, let alone from Dearborn, who use the local offices of this city and the Arab American population as shields for their activities. Case in point for that is Kair's insistence that recognizing officially that the Muslim Brotherhood is a terrorist organization would somehow harm the civil rights of average Arab Muslims in Dearborn or in the United States at large. Such a contention is absurd, but it has so far worked because very few on the non-left have even tried to contest it, leaving room for further Islamist disinformation and speculation. This will not be fixed unless those who tend to like civilization start understanding where the battle is. And it is not at the Arabic festival in Dearborn, but at the organizational level in the local politics and, yes, of course, in the Democratic Party. One way to do that is to start getting access to the internal discussion. For all the resources the non-left has invested in this, there is still no reliable intelligence source pertaining to the internal organizational structure of the collection of groups that use Dearborn as a headquarters. And that is terrible and has to change. Another way to do that is for political operatives of the non-left to get a foothold in the city both overtly and covertly. While I am aware of several covert attempts, the obvious ones were still not there at the time of my visit, and I kinda doubt anything has changed in the last year. But it will have to change. And finally, the non-left should strive harder to get in their corner a few Arab Americans. You'd be surprised how efficient intelligence gathering gets once you have your own guy in the field at all times. Also, for as long as there are nominal Democrats who run the local administration, in public propaganda, operatives should always strive to hold the social life up to the progressive book of rules. And there's plenty of unprogressive things in Dearborn, from the brutal segregation to the prevalence of hijabs, which is oppression of women, lest we forget. The view is not that the Democrats will start speaking out against these things. They won't, and we all know why. But that they'll be forced to weasel around the issue, thus proving to the neutral audience, slowly, that the Democrats are full of it. The Islamist interests simply piggybacked on the pre-existent Arab American community, and any non-leftist effort, if it is to succeed, must keep its eyes on the prize, namely those Islamist interests. Get that right, and most of the things wrong now can be fixed in a decade, possibly even faster if you're lucky. Sadly, so far the non-left has been busy on tangential issues which most people don't see an issue with anyway, or even if they do, can't exactly be fixed. Not within the American framework anyway. So, to sum up, Dearborn, Michigan is a place where cars are still being made, half of the city works for Ford, and while normal people are busy working and making a living, a tiny clique of heavily and dubiously funded Islamists have managed to use the ethnicity and the religion of some people in the city as a way to advance their bid for power, and also interests that are alien to mainstream American culture and indeed outright hostile to America itself. The way this can be fixed is not so much through theatricals, though that may be useful for rallying up the base, but through fine-tuned work that emphasizes the issue without affecting innocent third parties. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the non-left should avoid offending the sensibilities of those following a religion of special needs. Some of that will happen anyway, and that's fine. No ideology has a right not to have its fifis hurt. But what I am saying is that the approach of Muslim man bad has obviously not worked, and even worse, strengthened the position of the truly malicious actors who hide pretty comfortably behind hard-working individuals who'd prefer to be left alone, first and foremost. This is standard Islamist practice in any form of warfare. Hide behind innocent people and then scream victimhood when anyone attempts anything. It's what Hamas does, and it's what Caire does. The answer is in targeted actions meant to uproot the rot while leaving everyone else alone. This not only makes sense from a practical politics perspective, but it's also the moral approach as well. Anyway, there's a lot to be said about what to do when it comes to places like these, because keep in mind, Dearborn is not the only example, but I will stop here for now and yield the floor to you. What do you all think? Let's keep the conversation going for a while, because such instances are not going away anytime soon, and the non-left will necessarily have to be better prepared in the coming years if the non-left is to use its momentum to start taking back some of the lost field. Dearborn shows that it is possible despite what the cathedral might tell you, but without the proper knowledge and wisdom, the moment can just as easily be missed as it has arrived. So with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous support. Please do consider a donation should you derive any value from the work being done here. Visit our website, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.